tangent to find missing angles. And so what this is going to involve is something called inverse functions. And here's what they look like. So you see these right here. You'll have sine, cosine, or tangent with this little -1. It'll look like an exponent next to it. And the way you would read that is you would say this is inverse sine, or inverse cosine, or inverse tangent. Another way you'll sometimes see these written is with the letters ARC in front of them. So that'd be arc sine, or arc cosine, or arc tangent. And it means the exact same thing. So both of these are different ways of writing the exact same thing. And you'll see an example of this when I do a problem on the calculator in a second. But what these inverses do is they ask what angle is going to give you a certain sine or cosine or tangent. So if you think back to when we first started working with triangles and doing opposite adjacent hypotenuse, it would give you an angle and you would find its sine or its cosine or its tangent just by picking two sides and making a fraction. So now what we can do is we can take that fraction, we can use one of these inverse functions, and we can figure out what angle measurement would give us that fraction, would give us that sine or cosine or tangent. So here's an example. It says we have inverse sine of 3/4. So what that is asking us is what angle has a sine of 3/4. And the only way we're going to be able to do this right now without getting into very complicated stuff is with a calculator. So I'm going to go over to the Google calculator here. And first thing I need to do, as always, is make sure I'm set on degrees. So I got to click this button to make it set on degrees because we're still dealing with degrees here. And then to do an inverse, there on the Google calculator, there's this little INV button for inverse. So you click that, and you'll notice it puts the little -1 by the sine, cosine, and tangent. So I want to do inverse sine. So I'm going to click on this button with sine and the little -1. And on the Google calculator, when it comes up on the screen, it says arc sine. So remember, that's the exact same thing. It's just a different way of writing it. So my sine I was working with was 3/4. So 3/4, I'm just going to type it as 3 divided by 4. You can always do that with fractions. Type it as division. And then I'm going to hit equals. And that tells me that to get a sine of 3/4, I would need an angle that is about, if I round this off, 48.6 degrees. So if inverse sine of 3/4 is going to be 48.6 degrees. And that means a 48.6 degree angle would have a sine of about 3/4. All right, so before we get into the steps and the examples, just really quick, I want to show you a couple calculators. So if you're using a TI-84, and this is a TI-84 Plus, but any of the TI-84s would be very similar. Same with if you have a TI-83, it would be very similar as well. And on the right, we have like a TI-30 scientific calculator. On these types of calculators, there's a second button. It's this blue button in the upper right. And that's true on the big graphing calculators and also on the smaller, just scientific calculators. You have that second button. And then if you hit second and then hit sine, cosine, or tangent, that will bring up the inverse function. So you can see, you can't see it very well on the TI-30 over here on the right, but on the graphing calculator, you can see above the sine button, it says inverse sine, sine with little -1. Same with the cosine and tangent button. So that's how you would do it on these calculators. Hit second and then the sine, cosine, or tangent button. If you have a TI Inspire, you're going to have to pull up the Trig menu. There's like a Trig button. It'll pull up a menu, and the inverse functions will be there. And I can look for a video that'll explain that if you need that. But this is how you do it on your other graphing calculators and your scientific calculators. You can also use the Google calculator as well. So continuing here are the steps for finding a missing angle. So when you're finding a missing angle, you're not going to know the angle already because that's what you're looking for. So your reference angle is whatever angle you're being asked to find. So here on this triangle, we have this angle marked with a theta. That would be our reference angle. So you're looking for a theta or an x, or the problem might just say, find the measure of angle P or something like that. So you start from that angle, identify two sides you already know. To find a missing angle, you have to know two sides of the triangle. So you want to identify are those sides opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse. Then you want to set up your equation using sine, cosine, or tangent, just like we did before. Then you got to get out your calculator, make sure it's set on degrees. And then what you're going to use to figure out your answer and to find your missing angle is inverse sine, inverse cosine, or inverse tangent. So these steps will make more sense once we do some examples. So we're going to go through 3 examples here. Here's the first one. It says find the value of x. So x is our reference angle. So we're going to start by labeling our sides. And I always like to start with the hypotenuse, which is across from the right angle. So 8 is the hypotenuse. Then I usually like to find the opposite side. So I take my reference angle, which is the x, and I go across the triangle until I hit another side. And so my opposite side is going to be the 3. The remaining side will be the adjacent side, but I don't need to mark that because I'm not using that side. There's no number on it. I don't need that. So the two sides I'm working with are the hypotenuse and the opposite. So I know this is going to involve sine. So now I can set up my equation. I'm going to say sine of x because I don't know the measure of my angle, so I'm going to put x right there where I normally put the angle. And then I'm going to say is equal to my opposite over my hypotenuse. So 3 over 8. And now to work it out, the way this will work is I'm going to say inverse sine of that fraction, 3 over 8, will be equal to x, my missing angle. So that's what I'm going to type into the calculator. So I'm going to go back to the Google calculator here. I'm going to hit the inverse button, hit inverse sine. It'll say arc sine. And my fraction was 3/8. So 3 divided by 8. I hit equals. And it's about 22 degrees, 22.0 degrees when we round it off. So that's our value of x, is about 22 degrees. So I will say x is approximately 22 degrees. And a couple of things to look out for as you're doing these. First thing, whenever you're doing sine or cosine, when you set up your fraction, the big number should always be on the bottom. Your denominator should always be bigger than your numerator. That doesn't always work for tangent, but for sine and cosine, that's always the case. Second thing to look at is we're dealing with right triangles. Other than the right angle, the two angles on a right triangle are both acute angles. They have to be less than 90. So if you get a number greater than 90, or if you get a negative number, then you've probably done something wrong. Like maybe it wasn't set to degrees, or maybe you switched a couple numbers. So those are a couple things to look for as you go along here. So let's do the next one. It says find the value of x again. So this is our reference angle up here. I'm going to start finding my hypotenuse. That's 19 is the hypotenuse. I'll find my opposite side by going across from my reference angle. And the opposite side is the side at the bottom that's not marked at all. That means the 14.3 is my adjacent side. So the two sides I'm using here are the adjacent and the hypotenuse. So I'll cross out the opposite. I don't need that. And so I'm going to be using cosine this time, because it's adjacent and hypotenuse. So now I'm going to set up my equation. I'm going to say cosine of x, my missing angle, is equal to my adjacent, 14.3, over the hypotenuse, which is 19. And so now I'm going to do that as an inverse. I'm going to say inverse cosine of my fraction is equal to x, my missing angle. So now I go over to the calculator again, and I will do the inverse cosine of that fraction. So I'm going to hit the inverse button, This time I'm going to hit inverse cosine. It'll say arc cosine. And I'm going to say 14.3 over 19. And that gives me, if I round it off, 41.2 degrees. So my angle would be 41.2 degrees. And that is an acute angle, which is what I'm looking for. So that's one way we can check it and make sure we did it correctly. So 41.2 approximately. All right, one last example here. This time it says find the measure of angle B. So angle B over here is our reference angle. Again, start with the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is the side that doesn't have a number on it. So that's the one we're not using. I'm going to find the opposite side by starting at my reference angle and going across here. So that's the opposite side. The side that's left over is adjacent. So I'm not using my hypotenuse. I'm using opposite and adjacent. So this is a tangent problem. So I will say tangent of my missing angle, which is angle B, is equal to opposite over adjacent. So 4 over 7. So now I'm going to do the inverse tangent of 4 over 7. And that should tell me what my angle is. So one more time to the calculator. And once again, hit the inverse button, hit the inverse tangent button, and 4/7, right? 4 over 7 gives me an answer of approximately 29.7 degrees. So my answer here is approximately 29.7 degrees. So that is the measure of angle B. And I forgot to do this on the last example, but it's good to use the little squiggle equal sign here to say that this is approximate. This has been rounded off. This is not the exact answer, but it's very close to it. So that's how you find the missing angle of a right triangle. Again, make sure your calculator is set to degrees. And after that, it's just a matter of punching it in and getting your answer.